Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the fourth and last of his letters to a German friend, Albert Camus is writing just 1 month before the rather bloody liberation of Paris that's going to take place. And he says, "Now the moment of your defeat is approaching. I am writing you from a city known throughout the world, which is now preparing against you a celebration of freedom," which is going to be very hard-earned, as it will turn out. And he's going to be stressing to his German, essentially former friend, that things didn't have to go the way that they did, that they have, you might say, premises in common for the problem of the world and that of humanity, but they wind up taking different directions. And so about a third halfway through, he says, from the same principle, we derive different codes. And different codes there is a translation of des morales différentes, so different moralities. It's not just a matter of having a code. It's like an entire way of life and thinking about things, a set of commitments. And, for those who know something about Albert Camus, mainly from his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, and early writings like The Stranger, you're probably thinking of Camus as an absurdist. Life has no meaning, so therefore you can kind of make it up yourself as you go along. That's not even true in Myth of Sisyphus. He really stresses the importance of consistency and thinking things through and not throwing away your revolt. But in this, he's really stressing that there are directions that you can go in the face of absurdity that wind up being anti-human, deforming the human being. So he's going to tell him, for a long time, we both you and I, thought that this world had what's translated as no ultimate meaning. The French there is raison supérieure, so no reason, no account that makes sense of things. And consequently, we were cheated. There's a kind of frustration, frustré, that comes with that. And Camus says, I still think so, in a way, but I came to different conclusions from the ones you used to talk about, which for so many years now you've been trying to introduce into history, you and the other Nazis. I tell myself now, if I'd really followed your reasoning, I ought to approve what you're doing. And this is so serious, I must stop and consider it. So he says, I'm going to explain to you how we diverged. So he's going to intersperse a bunch of contrasts, and we're going to separate them out from how they arise in the text. We'll look first at how the Nazi views things. So he says, you never believed in the meaning of this world, and you therefore deduced the idea that everything was equivalent and good and evil could be defined according to one's wishes. So what is that going to look like? He goes on and says, you suppose that in the absence of any human or divine code, morality, the only values were that of the animal world, in other words, those of violence and cunning. And actually that's not even the real animal world, because we see animals taking care of each other. And anyway, we can put that aside. The Nazis tended to stress the animals of prey as opposed to those that get dominated by them. And he said, you concluded that man was negligible and his soul could be killed, that in the maddest of histories, the only pursuit for the individual was the adventure of power, and his only morality, the realism of conquests. And so he goes on and says, well, what was the difference? We're going to come to that. You turned your despair into intoxication, right? You freed yourself from despair by making a principle of it. You were willing to destroy man's works and fight him in order to add to his basic misery. And he's going to say, you ended up being willing to add to the injustice of our condition. So you said, things aren't good, so why shouldn't I be on top? Why shouldn't I exploit? Why shouldn't I dominate? Why shouldn't I humiliate? Why shouldn't I make myself, or the Nazis, the center of everything? And he accuses him of, because you were tired of fighting heaven, you relaxed into that exhausting adventure in which you had to mutilate souls and destroy the world. You chose injustice and sided with the gods. Now, why does he say sided with the gods? You sided with something that you projected above you that could displace responsibility and then tell you what to do, whether it was the old gods of some, neo-pagan revival, or the Führerprinzip, treating the great leader is something like a god. It doesn't matter. You projected that and you collaborated then with injustice. So that's the Nazi point of view. What does Camus oppose to this? How did Camus do things differently? He says, first off, at the beginning, I didn't actually have a valid argument to make against you. I had a fierce love of justice, which seemed to me as unreasonable as the most sudden passion. But I didn't, for that reason, because it was unreasonable, reject it. I followed it. And then he goes on and says, you accepted despair. I never yielded to it. Right? So he goes on and says, I refused to accept despair in that tortured world. I wanted human beings to rediscover their solidarity. What is solidarity? Being in community with each other, regarding each other, not necessarily as like equals, but as valuable as human beings in order to wage war against their revolting fate. The universe could lack meaning, and we could still be in solidarity with each other. And so he goes on, and he says that I chose justice to remain faithful to the world, right? And what does that mean? He says, I do believe this world has no ultimate meaning, but I know that something in it does have a meaning. So this is a very important point for those who are like, Camus thinks nothing has any meaning. He's a nihilist. He's an absurdist. No, this is where he's saying, here's what I actually believe. I know that something in this world has meaning, and what is it? Man, l'homme, or humanity. Because humanity is the creature that insists on having a meaning. It's in revolt. And this is in the myth of Sisyphus, if you actually read it. Because of our revolt against a world that seems meaningless, doesn't satisfy our desires, we give the world meaning in the process. And he says, this world at least has the truth of man, and our task is to provide its justification against fate itself, and it has no justification but man. Hence, he must be saved if we want to save the idea we have of life. And he says, you will look at me and smile scornfully and say, what do you mean by saving man? And here's what I mean by it: not mutilating him and giving a chance to the justice that man alone can conceive. So justice is not something that's once and for all, coming down from on high. It is something that we have to figure out ourselves, we human beings, right? And he goes on and says, this is why we are fighting. Your despair was your strength. That is what crushed us. But we thought that happiness was something that needed to also be protected and achieved. You left that out. So it's not just justice, it's also happiness that is absolutely important. He says, we thought happiness was the greatest of conquests, a victory over the fate imposed upon us, even in defeat. This longing, this desire for happiness, this recognition of its value did not leave us. And he goes on and says, we had to follow you. We had to fight. We had to become tough. And things have been very bad. But our difficult achievement, what was it? Following you, the Nazis, into war without forgetting happiness, forgetting that there has to be something after war, something higher than war, something that we have to work for. Even in a world that might not give us that happiness, we have to hold on to it, and that is a choice. And he says, we know now the weapons of happiness cannot be forged without considerable time and without too much blood. In order to have happiness, you have to defend it. So he says, we had to enter into your philosophy and be willing to resemble you somewhat. You chose a vague heroism. Why did the Nazis choose this vague heroism? Because it's the only value left in a world that's lost its meaning. So again, in an absurd world, heroism is one of the things you could use to try to restore meaning. And he says, having chosen it for yourself, you chose it for everybody else and for us. You started a war. We didn't want a war, but now we have to rise to the occasion of it. And then he's going to say, we became aware our superiority over you consisted in having a direction. And we can tell you something, heroism is necessary, but it's not much. It's not enough. We need to work for happiness, and happiness is more difficult than heroism. And you might say, how can happiness be more difficult than heroism? You just let happiness happen, right? Sit back and enjoy yourself, make yourself a drink, chill out. Well, in a world where people are trying to kill you, trying to dominate you, exploit you, that's not really an option. And happiness has to be striven for, we might say. So then he goes on and he's going to talk about what is going to be happening shortly in the future. He says, you are the man of injustice. There's nothing in the world my heart loathes so much. I'm fighting you because your logic is as criminal as your heart. But although I'm going to condemn you, I cannot lower myself to your level. At the very moment when I'm judging your horrible behavior, he says, I will remember that you and I started out from the same solitude, the same experience of the world, right? That you and we with all Europe are caught in the same tragedy of intelligence, awareness of absurdity. And despite yourselves, I shall still apply to you the name of man, which comes with certain commitments, certain implications, we could say. So he goes on and he says, in order to keep faith with ourselves, we are obliged to respect in you what you don't respect in others. So notice three terms here. Me or we, you, others. The way that you've treated others is the way that you deserve to be treated, Nazis. And you will be treated that way to some degree. You'll be imprisoned, you'll be shot, you'll be opposed. But we're not going to reduce you the way that you have done to others. And here he says something really interesting, maybe even paradoxical. The Nazis he talks about as having had an advantage. That's because they're ruthless. That's because they are willing to do things that others are not. They view that as a strength. And then he says, we, however, have superiority, right? So what is that superiority? It's not just a placing yourself above and thinking you're morally superior. It's rather taking seriously the demands of things that are difficult, like the fact that we have to work not just for our own happiness, but for that of others as well. And he says, I can tell you at the very moment when we're going to destroy you without pity, we feel no hatred for you. And even if tomorrow, like so many others, we had to die, we should still be without hatred. We cannot guarantee we won't be afraid. We will simply try to be reasonable, but we can guarantee we shall not hate anything, right? And he says, the advantage that you had over us, you still have it, but that very advantage constitutes our superiority. Our strength lies in thinking as you do about the essence in the world, that it's absurd, in rejecting no aspect of the drama that is ours, the human condition. But at the same time, we've saved the idea of man at the end of the disaster of the intelligence. And that idea, he says, will give us the undying courage to believe in a rebirth. This isn't the end. This isn't the final note of the story. And he says, we paid a very high price, but we have to prove we don't deserve so much injustice. This is the task we set ourselves. It will begin tomorrow in this night of Europe filled with the breath of summer. Millions of men, armed or unarmed, are getting ready for the fight. The dawn about to break will mark your final defeat. I know that heaven, which was indifferent, doesn't care, to your horrible victories, will be equally indifferent to your just defeat. But we shall at least have helped save man from the solitude to which you wish to relegate him. And he finishes by saying, now I can say farewell to you. Farewell is a way of saying goodbye for good. It's the end. You're never going to see each other after this point. And so he's saying this to his former friend. And of course, this is a way of him making sense of his own condition and writing to the rest of us who, the world has not been rid of the kind of evil that Camus is referencing here under the rubric of Nazis. There are always those who think that it's a matter of either you're with us or against us, and everybody's out for themselves, and since the world doesn't really have any meaning, let's just exploit each other. And there are those who have to stand up against that. So this is where his letters to a German friend are going to end, and it's where it's taken us. The realization that you can have an sort of existentialist or absurdist approach to things and say, yeah, the world doesn't make sense. It doesn't satisfy our reasonable desires, but that doesn't mean that we have to resort to something like a totalitarian vision or glorifying violence and injustice. Instead, we need to work for justice and happiness, and those are equally possible and continue to be valuable, even if the world doesn't have an ultimate meaning the way that Camus thinks it doesn't.